October 12, 1944. Somewhere near the Dutch-Belgian border. 0730 hours. The jeep's engine cut out in a clearing still wet with rain. British Lieutenant Colonel Edward Hayes stepped down into mud that sucked at his boots, the air sharp with diesel and rotting leaves. Behind him, 2 MPs cradled rifles but kept them low. They were expecting resistance, a collapsed supply depot, maybe looters or stragglers from a retreating Wehrmacht column. What they found instead was a woman. She was tied to a wooden post at the edge of what had once been a field hospital. Her Red Cross armband hung torn at the elbow. Around her neck, strung on twine like a carnival sign, was a square of cardboard. The word Veritarin had been scrawled in black paint. Traitor. Her head was down. Her knees had buckled, but the rope held her upright. Hayes raised one hand, wait, and approached alone. 30 feet, 20. Close enough now to see the bruising along her jaw, the caked blood at her hairline. Close enough to hear her breathing, shallow, rhythmic, still alive. He stopped 3 feet away. "Can you hear me?" Her head lifted slowly. Her eyes opened, pale, exhausted, but sharp. She looked at his uniform, his insignia, the lack of a weapon in his hand. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She said, in accented but clear English, "Please, water first." They braced for hatred. They found thirst. If this moment already shifts how you see the war, subscribe. The next will surprise you even more. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes unscrewed his canteen and held it to her lips. She drank carefully, eyes never leaving his. When she'd had enough, she nodded. He stepped back and gestured to one of the MPs, who came forward with a field knife and cut the ropes. She collapsed forward into Hayes's arms. Not dramatically, but with the dull weight of someone who had been standing for hours, maybe days. He lowered her to the ground. She sat in the mud, massaging her wrists. The cardboard sign lay beside her like a confession she hadn't written. "What happened here?" Hayes asked. She looked up at him, mouth tight. "I gave morphine to a British soldier. That's your job. They said it made me a traitor." "Who said?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The field hospital had been German. The soldier she treated had been enemy. And when her own side discovered it, they had made her an example. Hayes crouched down to her level. "What's your name?" "Marianne. Marianne Graff." "Nurse?" "Yes." "How long were you out here?" 2 nights. 2 nights tied to a post in October cold. No coat, no blanket. He looked at the clearing. Wheel ruts, boot prints, the skeletal remains of canvas tents half collapsed in the underbrush. The field hospital had been abandoned in haste. She had been left behind deliberately. Hayes stood and turned to the MPs. "Blanket, food if we have any, and get her in the jeep." One of the men hesitated. "Sir, she's German, I know." Hayes's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "She's also a prisoner of war, and we're not them." The blanket came first, a scratchy wool square that smelled of petrol and sweat. Marianne wrapped it around her shoulders without comment. Then a tin of corned beef and a spoon. She ate slowly, mechanically, her gaze fixed somewhere past the trees. Hayes watched her in silence. The war had taught him to read people quickly. This woman wasn't broken. She was sorting. When she finished, he asked, "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then let's go." She stood. Her legs shook, but she steadied herself against the post, the same post that had held her captive. For a moment, Hayes thought she might spit on it. Instead, she touched it once, lightly, as if marking something in her memory. Then she turned and walked toward the jeep. Marianne Graff had been a nurse for 3 years when the war came to find her. Born in a small Bavarian town where her father ran a pharmacy, she trained in Munich, moved to Hamburg, and by 1941 was stationed with a mobile surgical unit attached to the 15th Panzer Division in North Africa. The heat had been unbearable. The sand got into everything: wounds, water, bandages. She learned to work fast, to prioritize, to stop seeing faces and start seeing injuries. It was the only way to survive it. By 1943, after the collapse at Stalingrad and the Allied advance through Italy, her unit was reassigned to the Western Front. They followed the retreating Wehrmacht through France and into Belgium, setting up field hospitals in barns, churches, abandoned schools. The work never stopped. The supplies dwindled, and the orders became sharper. German soldiers first. Always first. Everyone else could wait. She'd followed those orders until October 10th, 1944, when a British paratrooper was brought in with a shattered femur and a sucking chest wound. He'd been captured during a skirmish near Eindhoven, barely conscious, drowning in his own blood. The German patients were stable. The morphine was limited. She made a choice. 2 days later, she was tied to a post with a sign around her neck. The jeep rattled west toward the Allied line. Marianne wedged between two MPs in the back. Hayes drove in silence, navigating cratered roads and burnt-out vehicles. The landscape was a study in exhaustion. Shattered windows, listing fences, fields scorched black by artillery. Every few miles they passed refugees, families with carts piled high, children riding on top, faces slack with cold and fatigue. Marianne watched them without expression. Once Hayes glanced back and caught her eye in the rearview mirror. "You'll be processed at Antwerp," he said. "Then likely transferred to a camp in England." She nodded. "It's not a punishment," he added. "You'll be fed. You'll have a bed. Medical care if you need it." "I understand." "Do you?" She met his gaze, steady. "You think I expect cruelty?" "Most do." "I don't." "Why not?" She looked out at the road. "Because I've seen what cruelty looks like, and you're not it." Hayes didn't respond, but something in his chest tightened. A recognition he couldn't name yet. By late afternoon, they reached the processing station outside Antwerp, a converted warehouse surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by Canadian infantry. Marianne was taken inside, logged, photographed, searched, and issued a brown wool dress, clean underclothes, and a pair of canvas shoes. Her nurse's uniform was folded and tagged. Her armband, the torn Red Cross, was placed in an envelope with her name on it. She was given a cot in a holding area with 20 other women, most of them German civilians picked up during the advance. Some wept. Some stared. Marianne sat on the edge of her cot, hands folded in her lap, and waited. A Canadian nurse brought soup, thin, salty, but hot, and a piece of bread. Marianne ate it slowly, tasting every bite. It was the first real meal she'd had in 3 days. That night she wrote in a small notebook she'd been allowed to keep, "I thought I would be afraid. I thought they would hurt me. Instead, they gave me soup. I don't know what to do with that." 3 days later, Marianne was transferred to a Liberty ship bound for England. She travelled in the hold with 40 other POWs, nurses, clerks, a few low-ranking officers. The crossing took 5 days. The ship rolled in heavy seas and most of the women were sick. Marianne wasn't. She sat on a bench near the porthole, watching the grey water churn, and thought about the British paratrooper. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if he'd survived, but she knew that the morphine she'd given him had been the right thing to do, even if it had cost her everything. On the third day, an American medic came below deck with a tray of sandwiches, white bread, tinned ham, a smear of mustard. He handed them out without comment, his face neutral. When he reached Marianne, he paused. "You speak English?" "Yes." "You a nurse?" "Yes." He nodded and handed her 2 sandwiches instead of 1. "You'll need your strength." She looked at him, confused. "Camps in England are tough," he said, "but they're fair." He moved on before she could respond. "If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more." Marianne arrived at Camp 186 in Lancashire on November 2nd, 1944. It was a repurposed textile mill surrounded by fencing and guard towers, housing just over 300 German POWs, mostly women, a mix of nurses, signals operators, and administrative staff captured across the Western Front. The commandant was a British Army major named Peter Caldwell, a man in his 50s with a limp from the First War and a reputation for running a disciplined but humane camp. When Marianne stepped off the transport truck, she expected barking orders and rough hands. Instead, she was met by a British nurse in uniform who checked her name against a clipboard and said, simply, "Follow me." The camp was organised like a small village. Barracks lined the perimeter, each one heated by coal stoves furnished with metal cots and thin mattresses. There was a communal kitchen, a laundry, a small infirmary, and a recreation hall where the women gathered in the evenings. The guards were present but distant, patrolling the fences but rarely entering the barracks unless called. The atmosphere was not freedom, but it was not terror either. It was something Marianne had not expected. Order. She was assigned to Barracks 7, a long room with 16 cots. Her bunk was near the stove. The woman in the next bed was named Ilse, 32, a signals clerk from Hamburg captured near Caen. Ilse had been in the camp for 2 months. "Is it always like this?" Marianne asked that first night, watching a group of women play cards near the stove. Ilse glanced up from her book. "Like what?" "Quiet." Ilse smiled faintly. "You'll get used to it. They don't yell here. They don't need to." Marianne frowned. "Why not?" "Because we're already beaten. They know it. We know it. So they treat us like people." Marianne lay back on her cot, staring at the rafters. She didn't know if that was mercy or strategy, but it unsettled her in a way cruelty never had. The rhythm of camp life was steady and deliberate. Wake at 700, roll call at 7:30. Breakfast, porridge, tea, bread with margarine. Then work assignments. Some women repaired uniforms, others worked in the kitchens or maintained the grounds. Marianne, because of her training, was assigned to the infirmary under the supervision of a British doctor named Lieutenant Harper. Harper was in his 40s, soft-spoken, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with practiced calm. He didn't interrogate Marianne. He simply handed her a stack of bandages and said, "We've got a flu outbreak. Start with the women in Barracks 3. She worked carefully, methodically, the way she'd been trained. Harper watched her for the first hour, then nodded and left her to it. By the end of the day, she'd treated 11 women. None of them thanked her, but none of them flinched either. That night she wrote, "They let me work. They let me be useful. I don't know why that matters so much, but it does." The policy that governed Marianne's treatment, and that of every POW in British custody, had been established in 1940, codified in a memo-stamped War Office Directive 12C. Its opening line was stark and deliberate. "Prisoners are soldiers, not slaves." Those 6 words became the spine of every camp, the logic behind every regulation. Security, diplomacy, morality, the 3 pillars. Security meant preventing escape and gathering intelligence, but without torture. Diplomacy meant ensuring that British POWs held abroad would be treated with reciprocal decency. Morality meant something harder to quantify. The belief that restraint, even in war, defined civilization. For the women in Camp 186, this translated into predictable meals, heated barracks, access to mail and medical care that didn't distinguish between captor and captive. It wasn't kindness, it was policy. But to women who had expected brutality, policy felt like grace. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, frost coated the windows each morning, and the women wore every layer they had. The camp distributed wool coats, British Army surplus, dyed grey to mark them as POW issue. Marianne received hers on November 18th. It was heavy, warm, and smelled faintly of mothballs. She put it on and felt, for the first time in months, safe. One afternoon in early December, Marianne was working in the infirmary when a young guard, no older than 20, knocked on the doorframe and asked if she had aspirin. His head was pounding, he said. Too much night duty. Lieutenant Harper was out, so Marianne handed him 2 tablets and a cup of water. He took them, nodded, and turned to leave. Then he paused. "You're the one they found tied up, aren't you?" Marianne stiffened. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, then said, quietly, "That was wrong. It was war." "No," he said, "it was wrong." He left before she could respond. Christmas, 1944, arrived with snow and a ration of Red Cross parcels, chocolate, tinned fruit, cigarettes, and small bars of soap wrapped in wax paper. The women of Camp 186 gathered in the recreation hall on Christmas Eve. There was no tree, but someone had fashioned a wreath from pine branches, and a few candles flickered on the windowsills. Major Caldwell stood at the front of the room and made a brief speech. He didn't mention the war. He didn't mention victory or defeat. He simply said, "You are far from home, so are we, but tonight we share this hall, this heat, and this meal. That is enough." The meal was modest: roast chicken, potatoes, carrots, and a small pudding. But it was served on plates with forks, at tables set with care. Marianne sat between Ilse and a woman named Greta, a former schoolteacher from Berlin. They ate in silence at first. Then Greta began to hum, softly, almost unconsciously, a melody Marianne recognized, "Stille Nacht." One by one, The others joined. Not loudly, not triumphantly. Just voices in a cold room singing a song older than the war. Marianne didn't sing, but she listened. And when it was over, she found tears on her face. That night she wrote, "I don't know if they mean to break us or heal us. But tonight, I felt human again." By spring, the war in Europe was collapsing. News filtered into the camp slowly, whispers, smuggled papers, the tone of the guards' conversations. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, surrender was imminent. The women didn't cheer. They sat in their barracks, staring at the walls, trying to imagine a world beyond the wire. Marianne's reaction was quieter than most. She had no family waiting for her. Her father had died in 1943, her mother in a bombing raid the following year. Hamburg was rubble, Bavaria was occupied, home was a word without a shape. On May 10, 1945, Major Caldwell gathered the camp for an announcement. The war was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Repatriation would begin within weeks. But he paused, choosing his words carefully. Any woman who wished to remain in Britain and apply for residency could do so. There would be work, there would be scrutiny, but there would be a chance. That night, 70 women requested repatriation. 53 applied to stay. Marianne was one of them. She stayed because there was nothing to return to, but also because something had shifted inside her. Something she couldn't name but felt in her chest, like a compass. Resetting. Lieutenant Harper offered her a position as a civilian nurse at a hospital in Manchester. She accepted. Ilse found work in a factory. Greta became a translator for the occupation authority. They wrote letters, they visited when they could, and they carried with them a memory that defied propaganda. That decency, even in war, was a choice, not mercy, not weakness, restraint. In 1947, Marianne returned to Lancashire for the first time since her release. The camp was being dismantled, fences torn down, barracks emptied, the ground prepared for redevelopment. She stood at the edge of the compound watching men in overalls load timber onto trucks and tried to remember what she had felt the day she arrived. Fear, exhaustion, disbelief, and then, slowly, something else. Something she'd spent 2 years trying to name. Hope. She walked to the spot where Barracks 7 had stood. The foundation was still visible, concrete pads where the stove had been, a few rusted nails scattered in the dirt. She crouched down and picked one up, turning it over in her palm. It was nothing, a piece of junk, but it had held something together once. She slipped it into her pocket. If this story moved you, subscribe, because history isn't just what happened, it's who we chose to be when it mattered. Years later, when asked what she remembered most about her time as a POW, Marianne Graff would not speak of hunger or cold or fear. She would speak of a young guard who apologised, of a doctor who let her work, of a Christmas hymn sung in a language that was both hers and not hers. She would speak of a policy that said prisoners are soldiers, not slaves, and of the men and women who chose to honour it, even when no one was watching. She would speak of a war that taught her fear, and a peace that taught her mercy. Because in the end, it wasn't the cruelty that defined them. It was the restraint. And restraint, she learned, was the highest form of strength. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy.